So let me take a breath and we can dive in.
Alrighty.
Cool. So welcome everyone to HCN Live. This is a monthly opportunity for readers and supporters of High Country News to get a little look behind the scenes. My name is Greg Hanscom. I am the executive director and publisher of HCN. And thrilled to be here with Regina Lopez-Whiteskunk. Regina, have you had a second to catch your breath?
I have finally.
That is great. Well, Regina, I'm gonna let you say a few words about you and who you are, but I will just mention that Regina has played a really central role in efforts to protect the lands in the Bears Ears region of southern Utah over the years. Regina and her family have a long history in that area, and it sounds like we may even have a little like fresh news about you and your role in the Bears Ears. So, you want to introduce yourself and say hello?
Sure. My name's Regina Lopez-Whiteskunk. I'm a member of the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe. I'm of the Uinta and the Wemnooch bands. I currently reside on the reservation in southwestern Colorado in the community of Toyac, which is 11 miles south of Cortez. So just basically at the foothills of the Ute Mountain, which is adjacent to the Mesa Verde. I was born and raised in the area here, spent most of my life here with the exception of about 11 years, which I spent in southeastern Montana, raising my family, and returned home and completed my education in in technology, information technology, and went to work for my tribe. And it's within that time that I was convinced by several elders and local people to run for tribal leadership. First go round, I didn't quite get there, missed it by 3 votes. The next election, I tried again and got in by 3 votes. So I'm a big and firm believer on every vote counts, because it got me to where I needed to be to play a important role. And since then, I have enrolled with Western Colorado University in their Master's in Environmental Management program, and I currently am a candidate and hopefully will complete my master's program next spring. I work part-time for Montezuma Land Conservancy in Cortez, serving the Montezuma, Dolores, and parts of San Miguel counties, and truly have enjoyed that as their cross-cultural programs manager. And I still continue to do advocacy work on behalf of the land and our natural resources, and trying to encourage and really help cultivate healing and conversations between tribal and non-tribal communities and organizations.
Great. Well, it's great to have you, and I want to hear a little bit about kind of some of the broader work that you're doing on collaborative land management. But I thought we could start with Bears Ears, and I thought we could start with really kind of going back to the basics here. I think for a lot of people, Bears Ears has become synonymous with the national monument that President Obama famously used his executive powers under the Antiquities Act to proclaim when he was president. The national monument that President Trump famously or infamously, depending on your perspective, used his executive powers under the same act to shrink by 85%. And then the very same monument that President Biden last October used the same powers to restore. So I think a lot of people, when they think of Bears Ears, they think of this kind of spot on the map that seems to be growing and shrinking and growing and shrinking, maybe a place they'll visit someday. I just wondered if you could tell us about the place. Can you kind of
Sure.
describe it for us?
So the Bears Ears landscape is basically within or near the Four Corners area in southeastern Utah. And it's beautiful high desert country with a lot of red rocks and just a diverse landscape. I mean, you could drive a half an hour and be in a very mountainous area. You could take a drive south 15, 20 minutes off of that area, and you could be in the deserts and very much with the backdrop of Monument Valley and those types of rock and desert formations. You get to see a wide range of wildlife. I can remember driving into the mountainous area near the meadows of where the Bears Ears Buttes are and seeing, a herd of elk. And then driving south and you're seeing rabbits and you're seeing other forms of wildlife, and there's just plenty of green open spaces that have lush pine trees and cottonwood trees and aspen groves, groves and meadows with native grasses. And then you can drive a few minutes and you'll see more of the yucca and the desert-like plant life. There's just so much out there that is worth taking a moment and just absorbing. And it's such a special place to a lot of people. And I say this today, but I also want to acknowledge those that came before us, which were the ancestral Puebloan and who have left remnants of their lives out on the landscape, and their connection to tribes such as the Hopi and the Zuni and the multitude of pueblos that are located now in New Mexico. They have strong ties to these areas, and it is such a very special place that many of those groups visit a lot of these places in pilgrimage every year. A lot of what is out there really is still plays an active role in their culture and their ceremonies today. As even many of the tribes collect herbs and utilize what is grown in that area. During some of the work, we were fortunate and honored to learn that there were a couple of herbs that only grow in that landscape, which, I mean, for us, it just makes all the more worthwhile knowing how much the work is necessary. It's not as much, the idea of doing right. It's that it is necessary to continue to see things like that have the opportunity to grow and to also have that relationship with people. And that's the big thing about this landscape. It's more about the relationship with people. It's coexisting between the plant life, the wildlife, the natural resources of the land, and people. We're all in one system. We all share this very special place. And, current day, we all utilize the land in different ways. I think the biggest part for me that has served as the largest challenge is trying to navigate and figure out how to figure out those ways we all can steward the land, protect the land, access the land, and ensure that it's there for our next generations.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit, if you had, I mean, the people have been fighting over this region for a long time. I mean, in my short experience with this, I remember in the 80s, fights over designating wilderness. The Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance had its big book full of roadless areas they wanted to protect. As a reporter in the 90s and the early 2000s, I did a lot of reporting on this fight about can we provide some permanent protection for some of these areas, cultural resources, but also wild places, so that they don't end up being developed by the energy industry or off-road vehicle users, that kind of thing. Tell me about how you got involved in the more recent conversations about protecting the Bears Ears region.
Sure. It was during about 2014 when my tribal chairman of the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe approached me about helping with, at that point, it was basically an initiative. And initially, what we were being approached about was, and the conversation in that respect, what was on the table was what was known as the Utah Public Lands Initiative. And because of that conversation, a grassroots organization, the Utah Dene Bikea group, had already started collecting cultural and traditional data from the Dene people, and were really trying to weigh in on that conversation, but realized that they just did not quite have the authority or the voice that the tribes would, being that they are forms of government and they have officials that are elected by their people. And so we were all approached about that time about coming together, creating a group to weigh in on this conversation of protection of this landscape. And it was in July, about mid-July, when we all gathered in Toyac. And I remember that day very distinctly, because at that point in time, I was still not entirely informed about things. So as I was going along, it was just as much a learning opportunity, but it was also the right customary inspiration for me to reach out to my elders and my family and other people in our community about this landscape and the meaning and the connection. So it served me personally as much as it did my people as me being an elected official. And at the end of that meeting, prior to us going over to the Bears Ears meadows there, it was asked, those tribes, and they invited a whole slew of tribes from this whole region. So we had people from the Grand Canyon area. We had many of the Paiute tribes here, the Goshutes, and several of the Pueblo people. And it was actually the All Pueblo Council who carried the first resolution that was serving as support to the Bears Ears conversation in that, which kind of laid the fundamental pathway for many of us to come forth, and we all followed. So at the end of the day, it was asked those tribes who wish to become a part of this organization, become a part of this group, this coalition, after lunch, have a seat at the table. And those of you who wish to remain supportive, but are going to be, not quite on the front line or make that commitment on behalf of your tribes, you could sit on the outer portion of the room where chairs were set up. So when we came back, we all kind of had a moment to consult and make phone calls back to our prospective members of council and kind of weigh in on. And by all means, my tribe, of course, was definitely in and wanted that commitment. And so I represented the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe that day. And it was really interesting because I think the thought was, and the question was, okay, now that those that are sitting at the table, now what do we do? And I said, well, in any other meeting that, encompasses elected leaders, I said, well, how about I just make a motion that the 5 tribes sitting at the table make the makeup of the coalition moving forth today. And then I got a second, and we were kind of just operating unofficially, but kind of in an official capacity. And really that was that first step of really solidifying the group coming together. And we all made one agreement that we were going to leave all other politics when we gathered from that day forward. And that the 5 tribes at the table were so recognized, which were the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, the Pueblo of Zuni, the Hopi Tribe, the Navajo Nation, and the Ute Indian Tribe of Utah. And so really that's kind of the day that I really kind of got my foot in the door, and I've never been able to pull it out.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because I was kind of just filling in for somebody, and kind of providing that support. But because I made that bold motion, I kind of ended up being there.
You've got no one to blame but yourself. Well,
Exactly.
I have another question for you. First, just a reminder to the audience, folks, this is HCN Live, a chance to get a peek behind the scenes at High Country News. I'm Greg Hanscom, Executive Director and Publisher, and I'm here with Regina Lopez-Whiteskunk. You can see us, we cannot see you. If you have questions for Regina, drop them in the chat. We're going to spend the second half of the program here just taking questions from the audience. So please just drop them there, and then I'll keep an eye on those and toss your questions into the mix as well. So Regina, you described this day when you got involved. I assume at that point you weren't thinking of a national monument, or were you? Was there some idea of where this would end?
No, actually, and it really goes back to what your question was, about how we were going to approach permanent protection for this landscape. And everybody knows as well as I do, a more secured permanent protection would be secured through an act of Congress, which was what many were hoping, which also was nicknamed, the grand negotiation through the Public Lands Initiative. And we actually had waited for the draft. We waited and we waited, and finally we got the draft, and we were able to read the draft and pull it apart and ask questions. Can we still negotiate aspects of what has been presented in terms of the Utah Public Lands Initiative? And the response that we got from the Utah delegation was no. But there were definite deal breakers in that piece of writing. And, we really wanted to be able to work with the Utah delegation. But, when you get a response like that, and we continually through that whole time period experienced a lot of that sort of leadership, and not really wanting to take the tribe seriously, not really engaging in conversation. Yes, granted, they did have conversations with us, but that wasn't exactly moving things forward and allowing the tribes to have clear-cut moments to contribute to this, and that we would feel like we're contributing to it. And so it was just a long period of time before December of that year that we just finally said, they're not going to take us seriously. What's our next choice? Approaching the president, asking him to utilize the Antiquities Act to designate this area based on X, Y, and Z. And he had our proposal we had rolled out in October of that year. So both members of Congress and specifically the Natural Resource Committee, as well as the Department of Interior, all received the original proposal put together by the 5 tribes. And we asked for 1.9 million acres And we spent a lot of time. We really wanted to position that request to be able to have firm and legal stances should it be granted. We definitely wanted to make sure that we tried to cover all our bases and really secure a lot of the vulnerabilities that might be the undoing of that. And we did. We spent a lot of time. We spent a lot of long hours, long meetings together. And mind you, we did a lot of this on consensus. So when one did not understand or solely get behind something, we held back until we all agreed, and then we moved forward. And then the other beautiful aspect of all of that was in the very beginning, when we came together, all the organizations, whether they were part of outdoor recreation, a lot of the conservation groups, NGOs, we asked them to stay behind the tribal leaders because we afforded sovereign voices. We also had afforded the opportunity to have government to government conversations with members of the federal agencies, as well as the President of the United States and his administration, which a lot of organizations really don't have that capacity. And so, you know, we were very honored that those groups agreed and really moved with us rather than out in front of us.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that period of time, and I had done some reporting in southwestern Utah. There was talk at the time, and I'm not going to get the year right, but it was like 2014, 2013 area. I think when Representative Bishop and others were talking about the grand compromise, we're finally going to settle these disputes over the public lands in Utah. I remember talking to a representative of the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance who said, maybe SUA will finally go out of business. You know, maybe we'll finally settle this and be done. We can all go on with our lives and do other things. Of course, that is not the way that it played out. It, you know, things fell apart. But I also remember talking to conservationists who saw what you were doing and realized how different it was than anything that they had seen before. And I remember in particular Bill Hedden, who was the longtime head of the Grand Canyon Trust, and he was kind of in the thick of the wilderness fight and fights over land protection and compromise. I remember one of the last conversations I had with him on this topic was, there's something really interesting happening right now with the tribes. And I remember him saying, I think that's where something's going to happen. Do you remember the day that President Obama signed the proclamation to create the monument?
I do. I had actually completed my term in November of 2016. So it was almost a month prior to when President Obama signed. But I recall that distinctly because I was in the doctor's office and received a phone call from the White House. And on the other end, they explained to me that President Obama was going to designate 1.35 million acres. And in my head, I'm going, ooh, 1.9, 1.35, we did not fare too shabby. I was really happy. And they went on to explain that he was going to sign in a couple of hours. And I was one of the first tribal leaders that they were calling to inform that he was going to be signing in a couple of hours. And I really needed to keep it under wraps until he officially signed. And so there I was in disbelief, all these emotions, because I was really getting concerned with our window of opportunity closing every day, getting tighter and tighter. I began to almost become one of the believers of he's not going to do it. It's not going to get done. I hung on to a string of hope every day, thinking this has got to be the day. And really, from the standpoint of when we approached the administration about utilizing the Antiquities Act, from that day on, I really worked hard from the standpoint that I already had a monument. I was already protecting the land. I had a vision of where, collaborative management would begin to play its part. I was already there prior to all of this, because that was the only way I could work in a proactive manner, was as though I already had it. So when I did get the call from the White House, I sat in the doctor's office crying, and the nurses came in and they were like, "Are you fine? Are you okay?" And I said, "Yes." They're like, "You want to talk about it?" I said, "No."
Can't talk about it right now.
And so, yeah, they got a little concerned for me, and I said, "No, it's really good." I said, "You'll understand in a couple of hours." But I was in a awe, and at the same time, I was very emotional, because I poured a lot of time, energy, and I carried, the knowledge of my elders and their requests so sacredly. Each time I would spend weeks, and at one point during my service, I spent a whole month away from home. That took a toll on me, because I'm very much a family person, and I'm very engaged with my culture and singing and dancing and everything. And those were moments when I didn't have that. Um, so that moment of being informed and being one of the first leaders to be informed really, was honoring, but at the same time, my emotions were all over the place. And yeah, the doctors almost administered some antidepressants to
me. No, really, I don't need these. Oh man. Well, I want to get to some reader questions, because there's some good ones coming in. And maybe we'll kind of skip over the Trump chapter here a bit, and just say, obviously Trump cut it back by 85%, added 11,000 acres over here just to keep everybody really happy about it. And then Biden came back and restored the original boundaries plus the 11,000 acres. How confident are you that Bears Ears is going to continue to be protected going forward, given this incredible seesaw that we've been through?
I would really like to put more confidence behind our governmental processes, but really, I think one thing that I did realize during the Trump administration was how much public participation played a role in all of this. But that was also one of the first things that administration had targeted to erode and weaken. And it's something that I continue to encourage people to be a part of public process. Weigh in, tell your stories, whether that's sing your song, write your books, write your op-eds, because that's really our voice, and that's really our right to share, and to be able to express that in relationship to those open spaces, specifically public lands. I think it was a hidden blessing, although it didn't feel so great. And it took me on this super hard, and even right now I find myself in a really strange place emotionally, because I just don't have that confidence and trust in a lot of policies, and even with our elected officials. I believe that some of the more permanent protections will lie within congressional actions, but those take so long. And we all have witnessed through history that during those proceedings, we could continue to see damage on the ground in these landscapes. We can continue to see oil and gas explorations continue, which also leads to even health issues, health concerns. And once these things are changed, they will never be the same. when the water gets contaminated, who knows how long that will ever be by the time it returns back to the state that we could utilize it for agricultural uses or for home and potable uses. It's just huge. And congressional action could take years. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that are out there that have good intentions and, you know, would serve great purposes, but they're still getting kicked around. They're getting presented year after year, and really think life is happening out on these landscapes.
Yeah, yeah. It feels tenuous. It feels wobbly. I'm going to jump to some questions from readers. First, though, again, this is HCN Live, a look behind the scenes at High Country News, and a conversation with Regina Lopez-Whiteskunk. And I'm Greg Hanscom, Executive Director and Publisher of High Country News. I want to mention that Regina is actually going to be speaking at an event that High Country News is hosting in Denver in 2 weeks from this very day. It's Friday, June 17th at the Denver Botanic Gardens. Invitations have gone out to most or all of our readers and donors in the Denver area. If you haven't received one and you'd like to attend, if you live outside the area and are going to be in Denver for some reason in 2 weeks and would like to join us, just let us know. You can drop something in the chat. We would love to have you at that event. Everyone. So, Regina, let's dive in. Paul asks, how, if this kind of gets at something we haven't really talked about, how, if at all, has the attitudes of the San Juan County commissioners improved toward addressing tribal concerns about the Bears Ears?
Well, back when we were working on the initial campaign for protection for the Bears Ears landscape, the county commissioners were made up of 2 non-native and 1. And at that point in time, neither of the 3 county commissioners of San Juan County there supported a monument of any sort. Today, it is actually flip-flopped in a different direction. 2 of the county commissioners are native, and they are also individuals who formerly worked very closely with many of us that were seeking the designation. And since then, they've also rescinded the opposition for support of the national monument and actually now support the national monument. So the attitude and the direction of the county commissioners definitely has changed.
Yeah, yeah. Francis asks how Deb Haaland's presence as the Secretary of the Interior has helped move forward your goals.
Well, I think she plays a very important role in helping others understand the long historical trauma and atrocities that have happened within our landscape. But as Deb Haaland has also expressed in a few of her speeches in respect to Bears Ears, she's of the Pueblo people, and the Pueblo people have connections and ties to this landscape, which I think is important. When you have that position and value, you fight from a whole different spiritual place. You have a direct connection. You are tied spiritually and through your ancestral ties to this landscape. And for many of us Indigenous people, it's important for us to protect these places, because this is where our legacies of culture, ceremony, knowledge, language, everything is and tied to. Our identity is of this land, and specifically places like Bears Ears. There's many other locations throughout the nation that serve the same capacity and role for other Indigenous tribes, and aren't protected. They may have some level of protection or maybe very little. But, I think that when we have someone like Deb Helen, who is there, she helps helps a lot of the conversations move on past the historical, having to retell history. And that was something that we ran into during the time period, working with the Department of Interior and many other agency people. We were always finding ourselves in positions where we were having to teach and retell history. And so many times it's retelling this. You don't necessarily have to do that when we have somebody like Deb, who, you know, in other spaces helps bring people along prior to these important conversations.
Right, right. I remember a conversation that I had years ago with Ed Marston, who was one of my predecessors as publisher of High Country News. And Ed was well known to be a champion of responsible ranchers, you know, ranchers who actually took care of the land, restored the land. And I remember one of his arguments was that if we take the ranchers off of the land, someone else is going to swoop in. You take people off the land and there are going to be other interests that come in to take their place. And of course, we've seen that play out really dramatically with oil and gas development in many ways. In some instances, ranchers have put up a fight, rarely have succeeded in terms of some of the oil and gas development on public lands and even on private lands with split estates. Do you feel like broadly tribes are now really stepping into that space? I feel like I'm seeing this in a much more forceful way, that the tribes are kind of claiming their place and their voices.
I feel like they are, and you know, one way to kind of bring that into light is, you know, at the time of when I started to engage in the conversation about the protection and access of the landscape in southeastern Utah, and understanding the roles and the obligations with the federal agencies, but also seeing that a lot of the federal agencies and the government, the United States government, has a trust responsibility to tribes. And that's the first thing that we have to understand. There is a trust responsibility to all federally recognized tribes, and what that means and how that really needs to be implemented from the agency levels, and also needs to be understood at very local levels, to know that tribes have a relationship, a direct relationship with those federal agencies and the government. But you know, even as tribes, we're trying to find our place in those conversations, because we've been, and I don't mean to say this disrespectfully, but it is just the sheer truth. We've all been good little Indians, stayed on our reservation, utilizing our resources the way we were supposed to, because we were told that's where you need to stay. But as you know, we're also feeling the awakening that our people, wherever they may come from, we had traditional Aboriginal homelands out in larger spaces beyond the reservation boundaries. And being able to be reconnected with those spaces, being able to revisit those mountains, those sacred, you know, where locations of springs were, and knowing where your grandparents may have been born, may not have been within the reservation boundaries. I myself, I know where my great grandfather was born, and it wasn't on the reservation. It was beyond that. But we always acknowledge and honor that. But being able to find your place in those public lands discussions, and even more so in other land discussions and natural resources, and seeing that relationship, I think we're finally gaining that right curiosity to start asking those right questions. I think eventually we began to move, and things will change as we find our places in these conversations, as we begin to hold the agencies accountable and responsible for all that they should have been doing, but have not. but it's also interesting seeing the change of old guard to new guard in these agency positions. A lot of those old guards are beginning to retire. Now we're going to see new generations, fresh blood, and hopefully they've all come from institutions that are giving them that knowledge about what treaty rights are, what water rights are, what the role between federally recognized tribes and trust responsibilities. I think that that's big. I think it's huge and necessary.
Yeah, yeah, and treaty rights in particular are kind of getting to your point of rights beyond reservation boundaries. Many tribes, right, have treaties that actually give them the right to hunt, fish, collect on traditional lands that span far beyond the boundaries of reservations. It's really fascinating. It's really fascinating to watch. Related question, and this one comes from Hillary. Would love to hear about co-management agreement. This kind of gets, I think, to your new role, your brand new role, right? You are officially a member of the Bears Ears National Monument Advisory Council. Is that right?
Management Advisory Committee.
Okay, thank you. So tell us what that is, and because it sounds like in a lot of ways, work was obviously stalled during the Trump administration, but it sounds like in a lot of ways, the real work around Bears Ears and collaborative management starts now.
Yes, we're looking to see that. So within the proclamation, the Bears Ears Commission, which are made up of the 5 tribes, and are designated per each tribe, will then have that opportunity to share management plans. And then from that point, once they have their management plans, they'll be able to share that with the Management Advisory Committee. And we get to review that and also advise BLM and US Forest, who are the 2 management land managers for the monument, and really play the role of seeing a lot of the recommendations and trying to ensure that, you know, the multitude of land users and concerns eventually will find their places within the management plans that the agencies are able to carry out, which for me is the next chapter in evolution in my journey with Bears Ears. I never dreamt it. I was nominated and I accepted the appointment from Secretary Howland just a few weeks ago and have been excited, but at the same time, I'm a little nervous. I'm like, okay, what is this going to entail? And so, yeah, I believe that this is an aspect of that collaborative management really actually moving forward versus either being halted or stalled or even moved backwards, which I think is a little bit of what happened between the 2 previous designations. It never entirely got off the ground under the Obama administration, completely took almost a different direction under the Trump administration. But I think with the Biden administration, we're going to move forward and hopefully continue to see some more of that demonstration of the collaborative management movement in a good direction.
Yeah. Can you give us a sense for us what collaborative management looks like? I know you're involved in some other efforts as well. I imagine that there's a real range of these relationships, but do you have an example of where this is working well now, or where it seems to be on a good track?
There's actually been a few places that collaborative management or a form of collaborative management have occurred, and namely, just right off the top of my head, in the Northwest with the salmon, the tribes there have worked very diligently with agencies in that format. And basically, a lot of the vision and thought of the indigenous federally recognized tribes, collaborative management to us is being able to take the traditional knowledge of the people and being able to braid it in with agency management plans, being able to braid science and that knowledge together, but also moving forward and creating partnerships between tribes and establishing more healing relationships between agencies, groups, tribal groups, and creating those opportunities at the level of higher institutions, and even being able to cultivate those relationships that will continue into our governmental systems, whether that's between tribal and federal or tribal and local. But really being able to try to break, collaboratively working together, creating partnerships and establishing those relationships that have been long strained. And I'm very fortunate right now to be working in a position that I really am helping to provide that conduit to conversation between the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe and the Montezuma Land Conservancy Group. And really, at the end of the day, what I've come to understand is, we all have land issues. The tribe has property, fee land, but we've also had those same challenges that the private landowners have also experienced, which is in this current state and economy, some people have lost land. But how do you creatively work together to try to figure out how to keep these, and how will we serve our communities through helping to educate through conservation, and maybe through that partnership and collaboration, you'll be able to hang on to the land rather than seeing it leave the hands of either the tribes or public landowners who may have had that in their families for generations, but serving a great purpose, but being able to hang on to that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. This isn't just about public lands. It's really interesting to see land trusts, right? Is that what the Montezuma?
Yes.
Conservancy is. So a lot of sort of a rising indigenous voice, not just in the way the public lands are managed, but also in the way that we manage and potentially heal private lands too. We're getting many variations on this question, and it may be the last one. We might have time for one more after this. But what can people do to support this kind of work, to support your work with Bears Ears, but also to support the work of Indigenous people working with the landscape?
If you could just learn a little bit more, if you live near a reservation, learn a little bit of the history. It's huge to understand the history, and to really also know the position that a lot of times we're speaking from. We speak from a very emotional place, a very spiritual place. We're very closely tied to who we are through every aspect of that, because that's, for us, is life. Wherever we walk is our church. Wherever we lay our head down is our home. And that could be anywhere. That could be under a tree. And knowing where those places are or have been historically, and understanding reservations are just where we live today, but we could have, my family, my mother's family, her maiden name is Colorado, and Chief Colorado roamed the entire state of Colorado. And so my family and ties could have been here, could have been in Aspen, could have been in Denver. He was cited in many different places. And so, having that understanding traditionally where the territories were really helps people understand why we're so tied to places beyond our reservations, and understanding the groups that may be out there. There's organizations like the Utah Dinebikea, which were the center and somewhat of the origination of that conversation. The Women of Bears Ears is another group. You know, a lot of the nonprofits that have been supporting a lot of the tribal work, Friends of Cedar Mesa, Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, Conservation Lands Foundation, even Patagonia. They all had a place in a lot of areas, and if you feel compelled to finding one area that may support that work, support them. You can support my work by just Googling me and seeing some of the organizations that I'm connected to. You know, I do a lot of things just because it feels right, and because I'm very tied to a very vast territory. But I also find myself speaking not only for Indigenous people, but for all people. And I see that relationship and connection. If you can do one thing today, be thankful for the ground beneath your feet and the air you get to breathe, and that delicious cup of water that you get to receive from the tap, because not everybody gets that.
Love it. Well, we should wrap up. I do want to share a comment from Mike in California. He says, here in California, many of the tribes are following the example set by the Intertribal Coalition, and the conservation organizations are happy to have them take the lead on some issues. So similar efforts underway in California. Also, a note from Dorita. I've lived in the area and volunteered with Friends of Cedar Mesa over the years. Dorita's question is, will we soon see Ute employees wearing public land management uniforms, helping to protect this sacred place?
I hope so. That is my dream and vision, that, you know, many of the young people will see the validity and value of a lot of the work that I do, and that they'll join me.
That's great.
So I can retire.
You can take a break. Well, thank you so much, Regina, for joining me and for joining all of us. And thanks to the 160 people or something who tuned in for all or part of this last hour. Again, this has been High Country News Live with Regina Lopez-Whiteskunk. I'm Greg Hanscom, the executive director and publisher. For folks in the Denver area, if you want to join us in 2 weeks at the Denver Botanic Garden and hear a little bit more from Regina and from some of the other folks at High Country News, hit us up. You can send me an email, put a note in the chat, reach out to us after this is done. We'd love to see you, and always loved these conversations and the questions that come in from all over the West and all over the country. So thanks again, Regina. Thanks to everybody. And we're going to take a break this summer on HCN Live, but we'll see you back next fall if we don't see you in Denver in 2 weeks. So.